Okay, let's talk about goal setting and pursuit. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is a toolkit episode, so I'm not going to talk too much about the mechanistic underpinnings of the protocols for goal setting and pursuit. I'm mostly just going to give you those protocols. But before I do that, I want to take just 3 minutes, I promise, just 3 minutes or less, and describe the neural circuitry involved in goal setting and pursuit. And there are 2 reasons to do that. First of all, the biology of goal setting and pursuit is absolutely beautiful. It's incredible that we and many other animals, in fact, have this neural circuitry and that it works in the way that it does. But equally important is that when we have a mechanistic understanding or framework for how a protocol or set of protocols work, it makes it much easier to tweak those protocols and customize them to our unique needs. Okay, so with that said, the goal setting and pursuit circuitry essentially consists of 4 major stations in the brain, although it's important to point out that each of those stations has a number of other connections that are important for the whole goal setting and pursuit process. But we can distill things down to 4 major hubs or stations within the brain, and those are the basal ganglia, the lateral prefrontal cortex, and the orbital frontal cortex. So going through those one by one, the amygdala is a structure within the brain. You actually have 2 of them, one on each side of the brain, that is involved in circuits associated with arousal, in driving levels of alertness. It's also involved in fear. You've probably heard that many times before, but also things like anxiety. And actually the amygdala can be involved in what we call positive valence experiences, not just the bad stuff like fear and anxiety, but also positive forms of arousal and even learning. The basal ganglia include a lot of different brain structures, but for sake of today's discussion, what you need to know is that the basal ganglia includes 2 major pathways. One is the so-called go pathway, which is the pathway involved in generating actions, and the other is the so-called no-go pathway, or the pathway involved in withholding or ceasing action. And this is really important to understand because with all goals, we have to ask ourselves, are we trying to learn how to do something new, or are we trying to withhold a certain set of actions? And of course, anytime we learn anything, it's a process of both generating and withholding certain actions. So we've got the amygdala and we have the basal ganglia, which has this go, action initiating, and no-go, action withholding circuitry within it. And then there's the lateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in immediate and long-term planning. And this is going to be a key component of today's discussion because we aren't going to be talking about lateral prefrontal cortex per se, but we are going to be talking about time perception in the context of setting and achieving our goals, because setting and achieving our goals is all about being able to orient both in space, knowing where we are and what we're doing, but also in time, know where we are in that road of progress toward achieving our goal or crossing that finish line and repeatedly updating those finish lines in many cases. And the 4th structure is the orbitofrontal cortex, which, like all brain areas, tends to be a multitasker, does a bunch of different things. But for sake of today's discussion, it's important to understand that the orbitofrontal cortex is involved in evaluation of our current emotional state and arousal state as it relates to our goal pursuit. For instance, are we happy because we are sensing progress? Or are we unhappy and feeling frustrated or sad or angry because we are feeling that we are not achieving progress, or that somehow we can't get into the sorts of actions that are going to allow us to eventually reach our goals? Okay, so I described 4 major structures, all of which communicate with each other, and of course, a lot of other brain areas. And those 4 structures were the amygdala, the basal ganglia, the go and no-go circuitry, the lateral prefrontal cortex, and the orbital frontal cortex. And those represent the core components of the neural circuitry involved in goal setting and pursuit.